When I was 15, I moved to Utah. It was a smaller town just north of Salt Lake City and far enough west that the wind could carry the smell of the lake, and the air would reek of spoiled sea. I got dropped halfway into the sophomore year, which was terrible for an awkward kid in a new place, because in Utah, they began high school with sophomore year, so I was effectively a freshman twice. The only luck I had was a girl I met called Sarah, and we started dating right after the end of the school year, so we were able to spend the majority of the summer together. Now, you might not know this about Mormons, and I certainly hadn't, but in their church, they really like big families. Something about spirits in heaven requiring bodies. So it wasn't uncommon for some of those more devout Mormon families to have 8, 9 or more kids. It just meant outdoor freezers packed with hamburger helpers and houses with bigger kitchens. Sarah's family were pretty Mormon, and my family didn't practice much of any religion, so we just never discussed it. She had 6 sisters, 7 including her, ranging from 6 to 18 years old. I only met her mum once. She was always pregnant, and I never spoke with her dad. I was a little too overwhelmed by meeting her family, and I avoided it. I probably would have figured it out by then, but I had only lived in Utah for 6 months, and everything seemed so weird to me. I remember a particular night I picked her up. She had a curfew, so that meant I had to park down the street so that she could sneak out. I wanted to jump over a small gully flank by the trees outside her house, but she refused, and we had to walk around, which meant passing her parents' window. I thought it was weird, but I just assumed she was worried she might get her feet wet. Anyway, it went on like that for a couple of months. I would stop down the street, and I would wait while she walked beside the gully around her house and up to the street to meet me. Sometimes I'd meet her at the road, but I was always careful not to walk too far onto the lawn for fear I'd wake her parents. One night it was raining, and I didn't want her to walk alone through the dark in the rain, so I planned on surprising her by meeting her at the back door of her house as she snuck out. To save time, I avoided walking by the window. I walked through the trees to the gully. The water was a bit higher and moving quicker than normal because of the rain runoff, but I figured I could make the jump. Man, I was wrong. My feet landed in the mud on the other side, but I sank instantly into the wet earth and splashed backwards hard into the muck. The cold rush of water was a shock, and I reached up and grabbed a storm drain, but what I had grabbed dislodged and flowed down with me. The water wasn't very deep, maybe 2 or 3 feet, so I stuck my shoes in it and stood up, holding what turned out to be a black garbage bag. I dropped it and started to crawl up, and my hands landed on another black garbage bag. I tried to crawl up, but they kept dislodging this sick, viscous grime. It must have been the 3rd or 4th time I tried to find something to grip on when I accidentally tore one open. At first I thought it was a rotten orange or something, but I could just make it out. Yellow skin, bloated on white bone. It was a skull. Tiny. A baby skull. I let out a shout. I didn't know what else to do. It smelled awful, and I had an overwhelming urge to get away from it. Quickly, I scrambled up through the mud and kicked myself up against a tree, my heart racing. Sarah was there. She was crying. She had been waiting for me by the street and came over when she heard me shout. She must have always known. I never saw her again, and all the girls were pulled out of school. The local news report said that the father had decided he had had enough kids and had been burying each newborn out by the gully, but they recovered 5 tiny bodies, all girls. And I wonder if he'd just been waiting for a son. Okay, this is my one encounter with a creepy situation. I used to work for a production company in Hollywood back in the 90s. It was a house that had been converted into an office. I would often stay after work and watch movies on the huge TV they had in the den upstairs. The people who owned the company were super rich, with a full-time security staff and live-in help. Throughout the night, every night, a guard would come down to the office to make sure all was well. And when I was there, I would hear them walking around, so I knew I was safe. I would hear them walking around, so I would go out and let them know I was there. Now, sometimes I would hear someone moving about, but just when I would go out, no one would be there. I always wrote it off, thinking I'd just missed them, or I was hearing things from the TV, etc. Well, one night, after I'd been at the company for almost a year, I'm at work, late, actually working. Where my desk was, just behind the reception desk, there was a half wall between me and the main floor. As I was sitting there, working on my project, I suddenly got that feeling that you know someone is looking at you. I looked up, over the wall, peering round the wall, and I see a lady's face. She had long, flowing white hair, pale skin, wide, crazy eyes, and her mouth was drawn back in rictus, really pulled back from her teeth to see an insane grin. Even as I stared at her, as she's staring back at me, I knew I wasn't seeing her with my eyes, if that makes sense. I was seeing her in my mind. I know that sounds nuts, but it's the only way I can explain it. That's exactly what I was experiencing. Anyway, we stared at each other for a good 10 seconds, and then I calmly turned back to my computer and went back to work. In my head though, I was freaking out, but I didn't let her see that, of course. I was convinced I was imagining things, but it was disturbing nonetheless. After a minute or so, I turned back and she was gone. I steadily, but swiftly, shut down my system and booked the hell out of there. After about a week, I was up at the owner's house, helping set up for a party or something. I'd become friendly with him, so I'm in the dining room with the husband, and I ask him if anything weird has ever happened in the office. He looks at me and says, "You've seen her too?" He went on to tell me that there were some ladies who worked in the house who refused to go into the office. Just wouldn't go near the place. I never could find anything out about the place before they bought it, or about the previous owners. Needless to say, my nights of TV watching there were done, and not long after, I left the company, although not because of her. I was home alone one night when I was 14. It was the middle of winter, and I lived on an anchorage about 8 kilometers out of town at the time. I was watching television in my basement, which was unfinished, so it was kind of creepy already. Concrete walls, and the floor and just boxes and stuff everywhere. I was watching a series of unfortunate events, and at my age it was kind of unsettling to watch it by myself. About halfway through the movie, the house phone begins to ring. I paused the movie and went upstairs to answer the phone. I picked up and it was one of my friends from school. We talked on the phone often, so it wasn't an urgent thing, just a casual conversation. I told him I was home alone, and pretty much as soon as I said that, the phone made a click sound and it went to silent. I said my friend's name a few times with no response. I started to get very freaked out because I was alone. After about 15 seconds of silence, I heard the scariest, most unsettling words. "I see you." It was in a high-pitched, crackly kind of voice. I threw the phone and ran outside. I slammed the door as hard as I could, and I was standing outside, no shoes, middle of winter, watching all the windows to see if I could see anything. I was outside for about an hour before my parents pulled into the driveway. I was bawling and shivering and was just too scared to move. They asked me what had happened, and I told them everything. My dad checked the house and all seemed pretty okay. And my mum then called my friend's parents to ask if their kids had pranked me, and no one said they did. I slept in my little sister's room, which was beside my parents' room, for about the next month because of the shock. It caused a lot of nightmares and trauma. The worst part is something similar happened again when I was alone, right after I got over that incident. Forget that house. My story takes place 3 years ago in the town of Bethany, Connecticut. I lived in this town for 3 years before I moved to upstate New York for college. It's an extremely small rural town with lots of farmland, trails and livestock. Horseback riding is very common. You see people riding every day. I loved living there, even if it was kind of out of the way. In high school, I met my girlfriend, who lived 3 towns over in Milford, Connecticut. a 30-minute drive away from my small town of Bethany. One night in early autumn, we were there, over at my house for dinner. We sat down and watched a movie, and then it was time to take her home. I was only 18, she was 17, and wasn't allowed to sleep over. It's about 10:45 at night, and she and I cram into my little Mazda 3 sedan, and we take off. In Bethany, there are no streetlights, so the roads are very dark. We drove about 2 miles out, and my girlfriend begins to panic because she left her phone over at my place. Frustrated, I decided to turn around and head back down to get it. I took a left turn down a road called Old Mill Road. Across from this road is a large concrete manufacturing plant. The road is about 100 yards long and is a dead end. A gated off trail is at the very end where people would horseback ride. However, about halfway down the road, another road branches off from Old Mill Road, which leads to a residential home. It's pitch black outside, and I drove slowly with my lights on full beam. Our car starts to approach the end of the road when we see two people standing near the edge of the gate. I switched to low beam as I didn't want to blind them. My girlfriend said something like, "Huh? What are they doing?" I started to make a K-turn around. I put the car into reverse, turning on the white reverse lights. As I backed up, my girlfriend said, "Watch out for those people." I looked out my rearview mirror to see two people. It was a man and a little girl, maybe about 7 years old. He was wearing jeans and an orange shirt. His skin was darker, possibly Hispanic. He was holding hands with a young girl who wore a pink skirt and had on a small pink backpack. It looked as if they were waiting for the school bus, but it was 11 p.m. at night. I then said, "They better move out the way because I've got to back up." I backed up towards them until they were only a few feet away from my rear bumper. They never even moved. Most parents who see a car backing up towards their child would have moved them out the way. They just stood there. My girlfriend, who babysat, said, "Geez, way to protect your kid," almost backed into them. I sat back in my seat and glanced at my rearview mirror to see the man and the girl illuminated by my reverse headlights. They didn't have faces. From their shoulders up it was fuzzy and transparent with just the outline of their heads. I could see straight through the forest behind them. I then got that awful feeling of horror mixed with dread and sadness, and just stared at them. I put the car into drive and slowly pulled away, watching them disappear into the darkness. I didn't say a word. In my mind, I was panicking. What did I just see? My girlfriend said, "That was so weird. What was he doing out there with his daughter at this hour, with no flashlight? That was so dangerous." I then said as calmly as I could manage, "Baby, they didn't have faces." I was almost in tears. I never had an experience like this before. She then started saying I was scaring her and she didn't know what I was talking about. I then pieced it all together. A man and his little girl waiting for the bus at 11 o'clock at night. It's pitch black outside. We almost backed into them and they didn't move out the way. And to top it all off, they had nothing from the shoulder up. They were ghosts. Like I said, I've never had an experience like that. You say to yourself that it is just a ghost. I'm a strong 18-year-old with big muscles and I'm not afraid of anything. But I will admit I was scared. My girlfriend ended up sleeping over at my house that night, and I'm thankful for the experience. This event occurred when I was 7 years old during the summer of 1968. At the time, we lived in an old farmhouse about a quarter of a mile away from an old church cemetery in South Wisconsin. I visited this cemetery on most days with my dog, Taffy. I would puzzle out the inscriptions on the tombstones, more than 100 years old, climb on trees, and just generally have a good time for a 7-year-old. I should also mention here that in the southeast corner of the cemetery, there was a collection of 4 rectangular tombstones laid flat on the ground in an open area. Whilst I knew every corner and stone of that place, strangely, something always made me sure I would never go over there. I never had any odd feeling or felt any threat, but whenever I approached that area, something would always distract me from going there. It was early August, and for some reason I got the crazy idea to go to the cemetery at night to see if I could spot a ghost. I was so used to the cemetery that I wasn't afraid. I just thought it would be a neat thing to do. So, on a moonlit night, after being put to bed, I managed to sneak out of the house and bring Taffy with me. I never had to keep Taffy on a leash. She would always dutifully stay within about 100 feet of me no matter where I went. When I got to the cemetery, I tempted fate by jumping on the tombstones with the hopes of insulting some ghost. I stopped and waited, but nothing happened. Only the sounds of crickets and Taffy nearby in the tall grass, looking for mice. I then stomped on the graves themselves, demanding loudly to be haunted. I waited. Nothing continued to happen, and Taffy still couldn't find a mouse, not even a ghost one. I eventually gave up, disappointed, and went back home. 2 nights later I returned. As before, I stomped on some graves and demanded to be haunted. Taffy was poking around within sight, a few yards away. But what happened next is a bit hard to describe. I was facing the corner of the cemetery I never went into. In one instant the crickets stopped, and the air above the corner seemed to freeze. Taffy was instantly alert, and then immediately bolted away, and a fraction of a second later I followed, running faster than I had ever run in my entire life. We were both heading for the house, and I somehow knew that the thing was in the air above me, chasing me. I actually beat the dog back to the house. I slammed the door, and I sensed that the thing that was flying around was encompassing the whole house. Now I hear this terrible panicky growl and scratching at the door. Taffy was still outside. I opened the door and I let her in as she wrapped herself around my legs, shivering. I couldn't walk without tripping over her, and at this point my mother had come down and wanted to know what the hell was going on, and stops mid-sentence when she notices the dog shaking between my legs. She knew something was up. The house we live at had its own troubles, and told me to get back to bed. I actually felt calm and no longer felt any presence outside at all. I slept soundly. Needless to say, I never asked to be haunted again.